seminar. The title is pretty ambitious, admittedly. Real-time modeling of crystal nucleation, growth, and breakage in agitated bioreactor. This is a big topic. And admittedly, what I'm going to be speaking about today is more related to broad strokes. Now we think about these models, the types of physics we include in these models, and how we can attack them. This field is so diverse, I'm going to end up leaving everyone unsatisfied at the end of this, because everyone has a very custom kind of crystallizer or whatnot, or they're going to have some sort of like inline wet mill or whatnot that's controlling particle size. That we could spend days talking about this topic, but foundationally, what I want to elucidate and talk about is how, again, some of the key physics we put inside the software, how we access those physics, how those gears turn, and how we can think about this problem using an approach like MSTAR, where we're tracking the time evolution of the fluid flow, scatter field, supersaturation concentration. We're tracking the time evolution of individual Lagrangian objects that are interacting with the fluid via some sort of mass transfer phenomena and growing and breaking up, etc. So again, we're not going to speak to your exact problem. I have toy problems here, but foundationally, through this seminar, you'll hopefully see, again, how I might piece this problem together in an environment that matches what I'm trying to simulate. So again, we're talking about these crystallization processes, and these are neat. You can kind of see them online and whatnot, even at the atomic level, watching how these crystals nucleate, how they form, how they grow. And it's really kind of cool. We have the technology now to actually watch crystals form, as it were, in a supersaturated solution in somewhat real time. That's pretty neat technology. But again, this is not an agitated vessel; it's just supersaturated fluid, as it were, under some high-powered microscope, watching the actual carriers coalesce and form. Here's something that's a bit more macroscopic. Again, I'll jump ahead here. This is just a droplet, but it's illustrating the physics we're talking about, the formation of these solid structures out of a supersaturated solution due to this transfer into the metastable region. We'll talk about that momentarily. So again, we'll talk about some of the key physics driving this behavior. Importantly, we're going to talk about subgrid phenomena, because we're thinking here about small nucleating particles and small crystals. So our mind should immediately be going to some sort of Lagrangian representation inside some sort of Eulerian fluid field. So there's going to be some sort of subgrid model informing energy dissipation. There's going to have to be some sort of subgrid model informing nucleation. We're not doing an atomistic simulation here. So we need some sort of subgrid models that capture these physics that are not being explicitly resolved. And I'll speak to turbulence, breakup, and nucleation as we go through it. Do a little case studies as we go through it, as well as talking about applications and next steps. I just wanted to show this video. It's not an agitated vessel. It's not a classical nucleation process as we might think about in, say, biopharma. But it's interesting. It's from this YouTube channel where they basically reproduce all the experiments in the show Breaking Bad with this disclaimer, don't make drugs. But it's interesting, though, because they do this crystallization process where they're trying to purify this initially dirty raw ingredient, which is a common application of crystallization. And if nothing else, to illustrate some of the key features here. So here we have some dirty, ingredients, as it were. We're putting IPA in there. We're stirring it up and heating it up to get it super saturated. So here we're stirring, not where the video stirring, obviously. We're heating up until we fully dissolve this material, this crystal, adding more and more fluid to get it uniformly heated. Eventually, it agitates. It dissolves, and we finally have some sort of saturated solution here, super saturated solution. And then, well, not surprisingly, we pack it with ice. We try to get it back. We get it out of that supersaturated region, and the crystals form. And the crystals that are forming here are pure, right? These are neat material, as it were. And so we can take these crystals out, and we have a higher purity version of what we started with. And we can repeat this process. We can do it with a mother liquor, as it were, to kind of repeat this process. But again, a cheeky example, it's not directly related to the agitated vessels and crystallizers we're talking about today, but analogous and illustrating this workflow about taking this saturated solution and having crystals come out of it in a way to purify this material. And I think it's an interesting channel nonetheless. Just to kind of give a shout out to them. Again, they start off with like, don't make drugs, which don't make drugs. But it's interesting just to watch, like, what this chemistry looks like that was portrayed on TV. I digress. So this process in more benign environments is used all the time for purification, for drugs that are actually making the transportable drug product. This process is inherently complex. It involves mass transfer, heat transfer, fluid hydrodynamics, particle mechanics, etc. And many of these things are closer to art than science. The crystals may be non-spherical. Organisms are spherical today. They're likely going to be needles or whatnot. They get ground up. But we're going to try to develop some mechanistic insights that explain what's going on. So here's a roadmap. And again, this is a nonlinear process. So I'm going to attempt to speak about it in kind of a one-dimensional manner, but just be sympathetic to me as I kind of walk back over myself and explain kind of the key players in this nucleation process. Now, the nucleation process necessarily begins with supersaturated feed, right? Something that's getting ready to birth crystals, as it were, because it's got too much fluid in it for a given temperature or pressure. This supersaturation leads to some sort of growth rate and nucleation rate. Now, the nucleation rate is the spontaneous production of crystals inside this broth. Alternatively, we can seed the system. If we seed the system, this nucleation rate is less informed by the supersaturation concentration and more informed by the seed density that we're applying to this particle, this broth. And this seeding could be either dry seeding or wet seeding. Dry seeding if we cast seeds into the top of the vessel, wet seeding if we put them in some sort of slurry. But at the end of the day, there's some sort of seed that's either nucleated or added to the system that grows. There's some sort of mass transfer physics going on from the supersaturated solution to the crystal, to the seed, as it were. The time evolution of this mass growth process and this crystal growth process leads to a particle size distribution. Depending on the operating condition, these particles may break up, right? They may break up due to shear. They may break up due to particle-particle collisions. They may break up due to interaction with solid surfaces. And those little satellite particles that form, they can become additional nucleation sites, as it were. So we can have nucleation due to seeding. We get nucleation due to spontaneous generation. We can have nucleation sites formed by little chipping, as it were, of the particles. This particle size distribution and the associated surface area inform some mass transfer rate. So again, as these crystals are forming, they're sucking, right? They're sucking their phase out of the supersaturated form. And so the supersaturation concentration is going down as this mass is being transferred to the solid phase. So it's a pretty complex process in terms of competition between the degree of supersaturation, the rate of growth, the formation of seeds or the addition of seeds, the rate of growth, potential variations in size due to breakup, the change in supersaturation due to mass transfer. There's a lot going on here. And again, please don't think of this as anything more than a very high level summary that was discussed in detail in textbooks. So where we typically start, though, what this process looks like, and this goes back to the movie I showed earlier, we typically start in this region here where we're supersaturated and move along into this labile region where we can participate in this nucleation process. Again, we want to be inside this supersaturated region and then slowly hug that solubility curve, typically with temperature modification, in an effort to have this ongoing crystallization. Nucleation, again, we can do dry seeding or wet seeding. If we're treating it as spontaneous, it's going to be a function of saturation as well as some sort of nucleation rate. Alternatively, secondary nucleation can be caused by collision breeding, where breaking up a particle creates a new satellite particle that can participate in subsequent nucleation and growth events. But foundationally, we typically operate inside this metastable region, and that requires careful balance between the temperature, the concentration, the addition of any other supersaturated solution as we kind of migrate through this crystallization process. But again, what we saw in that video is we went up this region here and then crystallized down by decreasing our temperature. The growth process, likewise, once we have a particle in there, whether it came by spontaneous nucleation, whether it came by dry seeding, I should say seeding, is going to be some function of the concentration difference, as well as some sort of growth rate and growth coefficient. Growth coefficient and area. There are lots of ways to approach this. We'll talk about a few moving through this. We may appeal to some sort of boundary layer theory and describe convective mass transfer as replenishing mass near the surface of the crystal. We may appear to some sort of intrinsic growth rate in an analogous way that people might describe intrinsic dissolution rates. But foundation is some sort of mass property that's informing this overall growth. Overall growth coefficient. This growth ultimately leads to the time evolution of some characteristic diameter. For spheres, this is easy to characterize. This has an exact solution here. For more complex particles like needles and whatnot, we don't have these simple closed form solutions. It's going to be some more complex function of the topology and shape. Not even considering yet what sort of spatial variations we have in the flow field. And again, this breakup process at kind of the end of the train here, there may be fluid-induced breakup. And we'll talk about this later on with some recently published literature where strain in the fluid is able to break particles up. And those are very friable particles, but it happens. Or you might have solid-induced breakup. This is a much more complex process where the particles hitting each other, or some sort of fast-moving blade, or some sort of rotor, some tooth in a rotor stator or whatnot, that can cause breakup or chipping. But foundationally, there can be a process whereby particles break up, obviously, once they get above a certain size due to growth. And again, just as a heads up, this is complicated, as I mentioned. This talk will leave everyone unsatisfied, hopefully equally unsatisfied, because this process is so complicated. But again, this idea of solid-induced breakup, whether it be chipping or frying or being hit by an impeller or impacting with other particles, as it were, these are complex breakup mechanics. And if I came in here and said, oh, well, this problem solved, use this relationship, I think I'd be a little intellectually dishonest. So I can present to you a framework for handling these physics and modeling particle-particle interaction, but foundationally, there's still work that has to go in to understanding how you're going to choose to model those physics within the context of your application. So carrying on, we want to develop a model here that includes these nucleation kinetics, these growth kinetics, these breakup kinetics. We want that to be a function of the operating conditions, the vessel geometry. We want to be able to predict from that the time evolution of the PSD. We want to be able to predict the time evolution of fluid properties. Ideally, we want to put into this model fluid and solid properties. We want to put into this model some sort of topology and operating condition. What we want to get out of this model is the time evolution of the particle size distribution, the time evolution of the growth rate, right? The time evolution of the supersaturation concentration. Ideally, we want this coupled. I understand this is ambitious, but it's what we'd like to do. So again, let's take a look at our notional crystallizer here. A simple agitated vessel. I'm going to consider two cases. One where I'm seeding. I'm actually putting particles inside the vessel and letting them grow. And one where I'm handling spontaneous nucleation. I'll speak to that later on. We're going to have some sort of isothermal supersaturated solution with some water-like viscosity. We're going to have some sort of seeding with some micrometer-sized particle and some stated growth rate as a function of the saturation concentration. The impeller will be spinning around, obviously, inside this vessel, and we'll watch these crystals grow and move. Now, before we get to this more complicated crystal growth process, I want to talk about our first subgrid model, and that's energy dissipation. And I can't understate this point enough, or overstate this point enough, is that if we can't get EDR right, energy or strain EDR right, it's going to be very hard for us to superimpose on this model more complex multi-phase dynamics. If I just step aside here from even crystallization, in any mass transfer process, whether it be multi-phase gas-liquid systems or solid suspension systems, or even a shear rate-dependent rheology, folks, if we're not getting strain and EDR right, or if we have a very heavy-handed correlation or closure model trying to conjure up what strain and EDR should be, and we're going to use physics or higher-level models that depend on that strain and EDR, we've got to check ourselves, okay? Because foundationally, if we can't convince ourselves that we're reliably predicting strain and EDR, it becomes a little less compelling to start stacking more sophisticated transfer models on top of that, okay? So let's talk about that first. So foundationally, velocity field, easy. We can validate the time evolution of the velocity, I should say the steady state velocity profile. We can validate kinetic energy, as it were. We can compare, velocity profiles to PID profile, measured PID data. We can validate power numbers and EDR and trailing vortex. And this is a good kind of high-level first step for understanding what the macroscopic flow looks like, how solutions and particles might be distributed. Again, as discussed in our last seminar about particle suspension, we can track NJS and see if there's any settling or whatnot that might have come. as gravity competes against drag in this agitated vessel. And importantly, all these simulations are time accurate, three-dimensional, and straightforward to link to the particles. Under the hood, we use an LBM solver to approximate solutions to Navier-Stokes equations. And just as a quick comment there, I meant that word. We use LBM to approximate solutions to Navier-Stokes. Or said again, we solve the Boltzmann transport equation in a way that satisfies Navier-Stokes. And maybe I'm being kind of anal here, but foundationally, no one's solving the Navier-Stokes equations. If we were solving the Navier-Stokes equations, we'd be getting international prizes. We're approximating solutions. So I don't know. Maybe I'm being overly nuanced, but it's a point worth saying. So velocity field, that checks out. We can look at that time and time again. The strain EDR is where we need to be a bit more judicious as we're going to go into these more sophisticated crystal growth and collision models. So we can do some kind of like macroscopic checks and make sure, okay, well, my power number, my blend time, my trailing vortex CDR, those are in line, and the blend time is actually for fast moving impeller. So that, check me on that. But foundationally, we can look at the strain field and say, okay, this seems reasonable. But then it's time to really think about, what's going on here in terms of the resolved versus unresolved. So we're solving the LBM in a way that allows us to solve these equations up here, the conservation of mass, conservation of momentum, from the velocity field, which is a solution to which comes out of solving the Navier-Stokes equations. We can predict strain EDR. Like this strain EDR, this is not unique to LBM. This is not unique to crystallization. This is not unique to M-star, as it were. This is what strain is, right? This is what strain is in a fluid field as a function of the calculated velocity field. Likewise, EDR is not a thing that's unique to LBM. EDR comes from strain. Like EDR is the double dot product of the strain rate tensor times viscosity. That's what EDR is. And so foundationally, these equations of motion, they're inarguable. What's arguable is the closure model and how we're choosing to account for the subgrid physics that are not being resolved explicitly. In our approach for turbulent fluids, we're using an LES closure model. What this means is that we are superimposing on the molecular viscosity some turbulent and/or eddy viscosity. That is, we're superimposing on the molecular viscosity an extra viscosity that accounts for these unresolved eddy motions. This total viscosity is what we're using when solving the Navier-Stokes equations. And so foundationally, there are two components to things like EDR. There is a resolved component, which is what we're calculating using the resolved strain rates. Then there is an unresolved component, which is what we're capturing using the subgrid filter. We can quantify the unresolved component and superimpose it on the resolved to predict total. But it's important to recognize that unresolved component is necessarily subgrid. So what does this look like in action? So here is just like a prototypical system here. And this green line represents the shaft power, represents the power going into the system as calculated by the torque on the impeller times the angular velocity of the impeller, right? This is what we would measure with a torque cell in a lab. And so this green data here represents the time evolution of that shaft power. We can compare that prediction to what we'd expect from the lab using literature power numbers. So again, this is power that has a unit. We can convert this into a power number, of course, and can make sure that our power number predicted from the code is in line with measured data to make sure, again, we're getting the right power, getting the right torques on the impeller. But the crystallization process is informed by local EDR, which should be tied to the torque, but not necessarily in a direct way. Said again, the EDR is going to be informed by torque via the first law, but it's not going to be linked to torque directly. So again, the crystals aren't looking through the fluid at the motor and seeing how much power it's drawing. The crystals are experiencing EDR inside the fluid, which is coming, of course, from the power that's being added to the fluid by the motor. And so foundationally, if I take a simulation like this and I integrate over the entire volume, I integrate the local energy dissipation rate. You recall, I told you, it's the double dot product of the strain rate tensor at each of these voxels. If I integrate that over the volume, I get this red line here. This is a very, very satisfying line, because what this line is telling us is that the volume integral of all the EDR is converging to the shaft power. which is agreeing with the measured power number. That is a very compelling handshake, because what it's telling me is that the code is satisfying the first law. I'm not enforcing this inside the code. We're not saying, oh, well, EDR must be equal to the shaft power, so let's normalize this. That's not happening at all. Foundation of the code is satisfying the first law, which is telling us the problem. And we can validate local EDR and trailing vortex EDR to kind of make sure we can pin this problem down. But again, this is what I was speaking to earlier. If we're going to start going to crystallization in EDR-dependent mass transfer physics, EDR-dependent breakup physics, EDR-dependent potentially particle size characteristics, we better make sure we get EDR right. You have to. And if you can't do this check, I don't know how much more sophisticated you can get in terms of a multi-phase or multi-physics model. Now, speaking to the LES component, this is where it really gets interesting. As I mentioned, there's a resolved and unresolved. And I apologize for the subscription. They should be different. They should be resolved and unresolved. That should be unresolved right there. So within the code, we know how much we're seeing explicitly, and we know how much we're not, right? And that's okay, but it's okay that we're not resolving it because we know how much we're missing. Said again, we know what we're missing at each voxel from the closure model. That is, the amount of energy dissipation we're missing is going to be a function of this turbulent viscosity and the strain rate tensor. And if we look across the vessel, you can see how close to DNS we are, loosely speaking, as a function of position. Like here in the far field, you know, an overwhelming majority of the energy that we're capturing is resolved energy. In the trailing vortex, where the EDR is much higher and the tail and the turbulent scales are smaller, we're explicitly capturing only maybe 50% of it. And again, it's not a problem from a process simulation standpoint because we know how much we're missing. We can calculate that from the closure model. But what's interesting here is that we start cranking up the resolution, not that we need to do this, but it's kind of a satisfying end result. We start cranking up the resolution, our resolved power eventually matches the shaft power. That is, the amount of energy resolved explicitly becomes equal to the amount of power that's being put into the system by the impeller and being put into that aligned with what we'd expect to be going into the system based on measured power number data. What does this mean? We're going from LES all the way up to DNS. We don't need to do that in most simulations because with the LES closure model, we can capture the magnitude of unresolved energy. But it's kind of satisfying here to see LES transition to DNS as the grid spacing gets smaller and smaller and smaller, as the grid space approaches the Kolmogorov length scale, and we go to capturing the entire turbulent energy spectrum. So again, it's like this. In RAND modeling, we're capturing kind of the bulk motion. We're capturing the big integral scale eddies and have to do a lot of modeling to make up for what's going on subgrid, which is actually where the crystallization process is being driven. In LES, we start poking down towards the Taylor scale and start resolving more of this energy cascade explicitly. In DNS, we see it all. So when we're increasing resolution, what that means, I should say that the wave number that we can measure, we can characterize from the turbulent field is related to the resolution, the lattice spacing. As our grid gets smaller, we're moving down this to larger and larger wave numbers. We're able to resolve from LES all the way to DNS. So to get the true DNS, we've got to be down to the Kolmogorov scale, which can be tough to do and isn't relevant for a lot of processes because the closure model is so simple because the dynamics inside the subgrid, inside the viscous region between Taylor and Kolmogorov are so universal. That's why LES models work so well, and we can predict the missing components so easily. But foundationally, it's very interesting to see LES become DNS as the resolution gets smaller. And again, why am I harping on this? Because we've got to have a very good handle on the subgrid kinetics, particularly EDR, if we're going to get a complex multi-physics and multi-phase transport phenomena right. Particles I'll speak more briefly about. As I mentioned, I talked about this at length in our last seminar, which is online as well. We're trying to track particles as Lagrangian objects, okay? As true to form Lagrangian objects. We can comfortably model, hundreds of millions of particles. We can, on a large GPU, we can get to billions. I understand that's probably much lower than the true number of particles, which may be closer to Avogadro's number in some crystallizers. But foundationally, as we get to this point where we're sampling the trajectories of hundreds of millions of particles, we can start to use, I'd say, simpler scaling models for anticipating the behavior of Avogadro's number of particles. So again, when we can saturate the system, I'm using that term numerically, not physically, with these tracer crystals to predict the Lagrangian performance of these crystals, it becomes easier for us to generalize the results to larger scale systems using either simple number scaling or just some sort of a surface area scaling. Population bounds models are in play. Generally speaking, though, I'm not super keen on them because they can become an alphabet soup of tuning parameters. Where possible, I would like to use a Lagrangian-based approach that tracked particle trajectories and growth explicitly, and then applied number and collision scaling where necessary, as opposed to binning particle sizes and modeling as a continuous phase. Let's talk about mass transfer here as we go into the growth and this kind of second subgrid model about what's going on at the interface. These are slides I shared during our last seminar when I was speaking about dissolution. You recall, this is kind of the opposite. We had crystals that were trying to dissolve inside of a vessel. And so foundationally, we had to specify some sort of convective mass transfer coefficient along the crystal surface. And this then was coupled to a scalar field to increase the dissolved ion concentration. So this is the opposite, but it's really analogous. And the key point is this, is whether it's dissolution and or crystallization, we needed some way to map these subgrid interfacial physics to the simulation. That is, we're not resolving, right, these individual near wall boundary layers along each particle. Instead, we need to put in some sort of subgrid transport model. In this case, described via Sherwood number or whatnot to recover KL, that described how mass was moving from the liquid through that diffusion sublayer, as it were, within the simulation. So again, just like EDR, this is a subgrid model. We need some sort of model that describes how mass is moving across that diffusion boundary layer. And this actually works quite well. So this is, again, the diffusion side, not the crystallization, but you recall this from our last presentation. We dump in a bunch of these crystals. This data is all sartorius, and we can then watch them dissolve as they disperse to the vessel and realize some sort of convective mass transfer along their fluid surface. Again, crystallization is different. We're going to be actually growing the crystal as opposed to dissolving it, but this idea should still ring true. This is another subgrid model, just like LES, or we're not capturing all the way down to the Kolmogorov length scale. In these simulations, we're not resolving the diffusion layer, because we need some sort of empirical framework for describing how mass will move from bulk liquid to that crystal, as it were, whether it's dissolution or crystallization. Okay, with those subgrid models in mind, let's kind of get to some of these actually like simulations and watching things go. Here is a seeded bioreactor, a seeded crystallizer, where I'm going to dump in a large number of particles. In this case, this actually isn't large, this is just 100,000. And I'm going to watch them grow in response to this specified growth kinetic here. The particles have been added, and here I can see my crystal position and my number of crystals versus diameter. This is a histogram. I'm seeing that the diameter is going up. Why? Because they're sucking species out of the dissolved phase and growing, right? As they're growing, they're starting to settle. And these are beefy crystals, and I kid ourselves. These are like 500 micrometers. They're big, but I'm just being demonstrative here. As they're growing, they're settling. Okay, this is a histogram of the crystal position, the number of crystals, and then think of these as bins moving up and down this tank. As these crystals are getting bigger, they tend to migrate towards the bottom of the vessel. All right, there's no breakable coalescence here. And it's a very simple notional system, but this is where I'm starting to kind of crack this egg open here, where I have this Lagrangian representation of the particles. So I'm able to see, let me just pause this here, a very nice dispersion, I should say, where I've got particles up here, because they're all pretty small. They're, 100 micrometers, 200 micrometers. But as time goes on and they swell, this distribution is going to shift to the left, and I have nothing at the top of my tank. And again, this is an illustration of a poorly suspended, a poorly distributed crystallizer, as it were, because I'm not suspending enough. My particles are getting too big. Again, you might say, well, then we're going to have some sort of, inline grinder or whatnot to make the particle smaller. You will, and that'd be good practice. But foundation, illustrating here, there's coupling between growth suspension, and transport within the context of one simulation here. Let's talk about breakup. And I want to highlight a paper that just came out last week, as a matter of fact. I thought it was kind of neat because what these authors did is they validated strain and breakup in this type of LBM modeling framework. So in this paper, it's not a crystallization paper, but it's adjacent and worth speaking to within the context of crystallization. The authors are trying to validate, and successfully, I should say, how particles break up when they're, what kind of shear they experience as they move through some agitated bioreactor. And I've got authors of this paper in the audience, so they're probably like shouting at me as they kind of misrepresent their data, and they can chirp up if they've got questions here to be sure. But foundationally, all these little microcarriers are used to sample what sort of strain is being experienced across the vessel. So again, over time, you let this guy crank, and you can predict what the mean particle size is converging to. And what this allows you to do is extract what sort of strain and EDR must have been present inside the vessel. Said again, the breakup characteristics of these particles is well characterized, such that if you had this size particle after many passes through the vessel, then you know what the max strain must have been. Okay, so again, they have well characterized friable particles, and by looking at their size distribution or minimum size, you can estimate what sort of strain exposure those particles must have seen inside the vessel. So again, it's breakup. It's obviously using some sort of friable particle, but it's illustrative because it speaks to, again, what we're talking about today, trying to get these flow physics right to estimate what sort of breakup phenomena these particles might be seeing. And this is also super cool. And so, for example, here are, I'll speak to the right side, this image first, and I'll go to this one on the left first. The right here represents what the experimentalists determined was the max stress these particles saw while they're buzzing through the vessel, right? And this is different scales because they're trying to look at scale-dependent processes, as it were. Red is measured data from the size distribution. Black is predicted data. Kind of cool. It's suggesting here that, okay, these maximum stresses and strains we're seeing inside the vessel are aligned with what we'd measure using these microprobes, as it were. Similarly, from the simulation, we can predict the full distribution of shear stress across the vessel. So rather than just looking at the maximum values, which are reported here from the experimental case, we can see the distribution as well. So the maxes match up pretty well. And more importantly, the distribution can be used to inform, again, some sort of bulk level system. And again, this is an agitated vessel. This is used for to characterize what sort of environment cells we're seeing, especially inside the trailing vortex with the EDRs maximized and whatnot. My point isn't that, oh, well, bioreactors should be used for crystallization. That's not the point. The point is that we can very reliably calculate things like strain and EDR using this framework, okay? And when we get those physics right, when we're getting strain and EDR right, whatever breakage model we hang on top of that, we can at least be confident that the underlying physics it's appealing to is valid. Said again, I told you before you're going to be unsatisfied with this talk because the breakup can be phenomenally complex. But what I can tell you is that under the hood, the EDRs and strains we're serving up can be used to reliably predict what sort of environment the particles will see and what sort of breakup kernel you choose to apply to those particles as a function of your known solid properties. So again, let's watch this here in action. This is the same general idea. I'm going to seed the system with crystals, but now there's breakup. A very simple breakup model, right? A very simple breakup model. It's just breaking up if the local EDR exceeds some cohesion force. But let's watch this in action. I'm going to play this a couple of times. There's a lot of physics to speak to. So first things first, let's look at the supersaturation. Okay, so I just seeded the system and immediately, like those crystals, those seeds, gobbled up whatever was in that system, right? So immediately we have this dead zone, as it were, where the crystals ate all they could. They ate it up and they've got no more eating to do. And that's why we see this kind of spike, or rather to say this decrease in the mass transfer rate. I'll speak to this slide next. The particles fall. And now I'm not showing the particles, there's too many of them, but eventually you're going to see like this gradual warming, I should say decrease in concentration. You can see it now if you look carefully, like the tones going from dark to light. You can see it's darker up top, then lighter down below. Gradually, we're seeing this competition between transfer to the particles. We're seeing heterogeneities in the concentration across the fluid, as it were. We're seeing this competition between mass transfer, mixing, suspension, etc. And down in some parts of the vessel, because we're not continually feeding in any sort of saturated solution, we're gobbling it all up. We're gobbling it up. All of the solutions going onto the particle, meaning what's left in the dissolved phase is going to the saturation value. And so again, I'll play this again, but here we're seeing, and I'm not showing the particles because there's too many to see here, but I'll show you kind of what's going on here. Too many to render is what I'm trying to say. It's very hard to render like 100 million particles. But again, watching this guy go, we'll play this again. So like, it looks like nothing's happening, but there is something happening. These particles are growing. They're sucking atoms, and I should say species, out of the dissolved phase. And we can see that here as this competition between transfer, mixing leads to heterogeneities in the concentration across the vessel. This impeller spinning. If you run MSTAR, you know that because it's explicit, sometimes the impeller suffers from aliasing, where it looks like it's in the same spot, especially if it's symmetric, because our frame rate matches our impeller speed, doesn't work. But that's kind of cool to see this kind of saturation region be non-uniform across the saturation levels, be non-uniform across the vessel. Let's take a look at the actual numbers here. So this black line here represents the supersaturation. This is how saturated this particular broth might be. And as expected, it decreases monotonically, right? It's just going from some saturation level down to some supersaturated level down to saturation level. And that's a monotonic decrease. The shape of this curve might vary, but the fact that it's monotonic is inarguable. Here is the actual mass transfer rate. It's plotted on the right here. These are all negative quantities, okay? And a negative quantity means that the particles are sucking it in, right? They're taking it out of the dissolved phase. And here's what we saw initially. Initially, we saw a mass transfer rate that went down in magnitude to 0. Why? Well, they gobbled everything up. They hadn't been able to move through the vessel. As a consequence, they couldn't grow. As they disperse, this mass transfer rate goes up in magnitude. Okay, I should say, increases in magnitude, eventually maximized around 15 seconds. Which do you go about 15 seconds? Well, at that point, they're well dispersed. Okay, at that point, they're well dispersed, right? Foundationally, though, the mass transfer rate does go down because the driving potential is decreasing. So again, this mass transfer rate is function not only the growth kinetic, but also the concentration difference. And as this difference goes to 0, the growth rate necessarily goes to 0 as well. So it's kind of cool to see this competition between mixing, suspension, broth concentration, and its net effect on growth rate over space and time. Let's take a look at kind of a system now with constant supersaturation. So in this case here, I'm going to be maintaining the system at a constant concentration, a constant saturation concentration, and I have breakup enabled inside this vessel. Again, I'll play this a couple times to speak to it. So I see the system with these, 100 micrometer particles. I see the system, and they start to grow. They're growing, but then we get these shadow particles that form. Why? That's the breakup. So again, we grow. Eventually, we get so big that we get too big for our own britches, and there are breakup phenomena. Look at that tail that's forming at about 550 micrometers. That tail that's forming, and these particles are so big, they're being ripped apart by shear. And so foundationally, this is not a nucleation process in the terms of the supersaturation. This is that secondary nucleation where we're having some sort of particle that's being chipped off, that's being broken off of the main particle, leading to yet another particle that can grow and swell. And eventually we get to some sort of ceiling here. We have some sort of EDR that's capping what the maximum particle size can be inside our vessel, and that acts as a ceiling. And so whenever a particle gets up there due to growth, it gets cut back down to size. Okay, and remember, this was a constant. I maintained the saturation level at a constant value here, so we're continually having some sort of feed that can be used to maintain my my C star, my saturation levels. But it's kind of cool to see this competition between growth, breakage, and the accordant size distribution that we realize inside the broth. Here we see things like the actual count going up, of course, as we get more and more of these crystals due to the breakup event, as well as the diameter that is going to be informed by the EDR inside the system. Said again, this max diameter, this diameter here, this is not max, this mean diameter here, is informed by our breakup kinetics, okay? And the number of crystals then is informed by our supersaturation concentration and the amount and how we're maintaining that, okay? If we kept this value higher, we would see more crystals, but that wouldn't change the max size, okay? If we changed our impeller speed, for example, that would inform our max size. But the max size is a kinematic property. The number of crystals is a function. I'm sorry, I said the max size is a mechanical property. The number of crystals is going to be a function of the actual driving potential and the saturation levels. Okay, heretofore, I've been talking exclusively about seeded systems, where I kind of threw in some sort of wet seed or dry seed and let the crystals grow on top of that. And some of these broke as it were after the fact. You know, as discussed, we can model a primary nucleation process and a spontaneous nucleation process as well. This gets somewhat empirical, or semi-empirical, I should say. You need to know something about a nucleation rate. You need to know something about what the concentration difference should be informing that birth rate, as it were. And so, foundation, you need some sort of insights if you have primary nucleation into what's driving these growth, this generation. But if you have them, you can put them into this type of framework. So for those of you who use MSTAR, you'll recognize this is a particle field. Look at this. In this particle field, I have no injection. There is no injection in the child. I have a child geometry there, but no injection inside of it, as it were. Instead, I just have this injection condition, a volumetric generation. What volumetric generation means is give the code a UDF that tells it when to look for nucleation. So in this guy here, I have the world's simplest nucleation model. Like if my saturation solution is greater than my saturation level, right? And in this case, I just pulled a random number. I just said, you know, if and I just set it to the difference, as it were. You can be more sophisticated. And I'm illustrating just how these gears turn. But if I have a certain condition met, then consider particle injection, as it were. So this is how we build this type of model. We don't have to always dry seed or wet seed or pre-seed, as it were. We can do primary nucleation, and the vehicle through which we do it is by doing this kind of volumetric generation framework inside MSTAR. If you scroll a bit lower, in fact, just for those keeping score at home who might be interested, here is the model that I use to kind of generate some of these movies. And if you look at this guy, I know I'm diverging a bit from kind of the slides, but I think people might be interested in this. Like I just did a simple convection model here. You can do something more sophisticated with the constant mass transfer coefficient or whatnot, or mass transfer rate. But I'm just using some sort of generic KL expression to model growth. I have some sort of molar volume, a saturation level, initial volume fraction. So foundationally, you might be up in arms over the fact that you're using a KL to model transfer through the thin film. That's okay. You can be up in arms, and you cannot like that, and that's okay. I'm not claiming it's right. What I am claiming is that the hooks are here. You can have this dissolved phase, talk to the Lagrangian phase, have it grow in proportion to the molar volume in the solid phase and whatnot. These hooks are here, the nucleation hooks are here. And you can have valid grievances about the selections I've made, and I'm open to that. But broad strokes, these gears can be turned to match the physics that you have in mind to describe this nucleation process. So let's watch this go. So here I have this nucleation process. So again, I'm not showing the particles, there are too many of them, but let's watch it go here. So here I have, again, this is diameter, and this is the number of particles. This is a particle size histogram. I let these particles come in, these kind of nucleated particles. I assigned them initial size of 10 micrometers, okay? I could have gone lower, I could have gone higher. That was the value I chose. So whenever I go into the system here, I initially have, look at that, see that spike at 10 to the minus 5? Like that is the primary nucleation, and it just rockets up. Like I just get this throughout the vessel, just like all these crystals form. But lo and behold, this nucleation rate, which is the prime nucleation rate, 10 to the minus 5, like it goes down. Look at that leftmost bin. It goes down fast. Look how low it is right there. It's a tiny fraction of the particles. Like, why is that happening? Well, eventually, remember, nucleation was driven by that saturation difference. As I'm gobbling atoms up out of the continuous phase, there's less and less of a potential for nucleation to occur, as it were, right? And so particles continue to grow, certainly, they're growing as they suck up molecules and atoms from the surrounding broth. And that's really cool to see. But the nucleation isn't driving things anymore. And I'll show this on the next slide. I don't have a potential to nucleate as much as I did when I started because my potential's gone down. As a consequence, I don't have this peak. The peak that started, this is how it was going, or how it went and how it's going, right? How it went, tons of nucleation there. How it's going, no nucleation, but just sustained growth due to some mass transfer kinetic at the interface there. Take a look at the slide, the animation on the left. Here's our saturation concentration. Again, it's lower in the trailing vortex here. Why? Because I elected to use an EDR-dependent transport relationship. If you don't like that, that's fine. Maybe you use some sort of intrinsic value. You wouldn't see these spatially dependent saturation concentrations unless you had a non-uniform particle distribution. But here, the reason why I'm getting these decreases in concentration of the impellers in the trailing vortex is because that is where mass transfer is happening most vigorously from the continuous phase into the discrete phase. And here's kind of what's going on behind the scenes. Again, mean concentration dropping down. It's going to eventually get down to 1 because mass transfer demands it. Particles grow over time in mean diameter. This is just the mean of that distribution there. Particle counts going up, as it were. There is some coalescence there, and this is going up because there's still some nucleation. It's just not very much. There is coalescence, and so these particles are getting a bit bigger, right? They are hitting each other. They're combining. They're fusing, as it were. But foundationally, that coalescence rate is small at this point compared to the nucleation rate. Now, eventually, let this thing run long enough. This mean concentration must get to 1, right? I've got to gobble everything up. Eventually, this particle count then will start to go down as things start to coalesce, and this mean diameter then approaches some larger value. So foundationally, this process would carry on to other sorts of extrema, which are kind of a bit beyond our scope right now. Okay, we're coming up on time. And so I want to kind of summarize a couple key points here and the ones I started with. These are ridiculously complex processes. Okay. The chemistry, the mechanics, the cell growth, the mass transfer are ridiculously complex. And it's very easy to get lost inside this alphabet soup. Our goal here is to develop, where possible, mechanistic couplings between these different transport phenomena in terms of the mixing of the supersaturated solution, the mass transfer physics, the EDR, et cetera, informing these transfer. We can't claim to have modeled all the perturbations that you might consider might have in your system, nor am I claiming that this particular grab bag of correlations and subgrid models I've used for, say, interfacial mass transfer is valid for your application. You might have some other more specific transport models. I would go pretty firm on the LES model and the subgrid turbulence model. That's a very low center of mass model in the sense that it's hard to topple. Not only does it have really a quasi tuning parameter, the Smag-Rinsky coefficient, which really shouldn't be adjusted much in my mind. It's not something to noodle around with. As a consequence, it's not tuned between runs. So I know we're getting EDR right. I know we're getting advection right. I know we have the ability to model mass transfer. The handshake is there, but the exact mechanism used to describe that coupling, that is up to you in the physics that are germane to your system. It is practical to run simulations at scale. These LES simulations at industrial scale. So again, we can comfortably handle a industrial scale crystallizer. It is practical to run simulations with hundreds of millions to even low billion numbers of crystals. That may require scaling if your crystal number density is very high, but we do prefer to attack the problem as using a Lagrangian representation for particles as opposed to continuous phase representations. We like at MSTAR using representations that model the nature of the transport carrier. Okay. Nothing I showed here ran for more than a few hours. Okay, so realistically, these are practical calculations. But again, as we get to larger and larger particle counts, there would need to be some sort of scaling to account for the fact that we may not be modeling all particles. And that would inform both a mean particle size and possibly some sort of dissolved species transfer rate. Okay, we've got a few minutes for questions. Thank you for joining us. I'm happy to speak to the slides. I'm happy to speak to any of these kind of basic model setup. I know people like to see that as well. But yeah, thank you much for tuning in. And yeah, any questions, I'm happy to take them and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you.
Yeah, it looks like we only have one question so far today. This was back when we were looking at the crystals settling at the base of the vessel. Oh, here's another one. You have a lot on the base. Do you also model the potential for two crystals to fuse together?
Yeah, and that's the physics we can. I actually was showing today as well. We kind of got to it, Tom, a little bit later on. But again, fusing is a process we can model, but that would again we'd have to use a simplified subgrid model, right? We can describe the net effective particles coming together, but heretofore all my particles have still been spheres. And so if I say, okay, these two particles come together and have some sort of like equivalent spheric, sphere volume, I can do it. But we don't yet have the ability to model, let's say, two spheres coming together to form like a dumbbell, right? That's not in the code yet. And likewise, you can model non-spherical objects, to be sure, but at this point, for speed-wise, it gets hard to do hundreds of millions of non-spherical DEM particles. We're sticking to spheres, but yeah, to be sure. Yeah, we can do cohesion, but Tom, with a big asterisk, because we don't yet have particles like lumping together to form some sort of like a bunch of grapes or whatnot.
Okay, another one from Tom. The breakage mechanisms you've described sound like an erosive mechanism. I assume it would just as easy if you had the model to model breakup as a fracturing mechanism or a mixture of erosion and fracturing. Again, assuming you had a correlation to use as the model, correct?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. The hard part is the subgrid model, right? And that's one of the points I try to concede is that we can track where all these particles are going. We can track how they're bumping into each other. We can track how they're hitting the blades, how they're hitting each other, as it were. And if you have some sort of subgrid model that describes, oh, if I collide with these sorts of kinetics, or I have these experience these sorts of strain rates, then I have this type of particle size resulting, fragmentation. We can cook it in. But yeah, Tom, the body's buried in the details, and you're right. And so we can define the paradigm. We still need a lot of help there. Yeah, great question.
Okay, next question. Any validation or a plan for validation in the future?
I need a help. If someone can, MSTAR does not have a lab. Okay, we have lots of GPUs, no lab. If someone has, measured, and this is where you've got to have a partner that has measured data. You've got to have someone that has the ability to characterize particle sizes and whatnot. Very much interested. If someone wants to do, I'm optimistic that the gears are there. I'm optimistic we can identify an appropriate set of subgrid models. But to be sure, if someone has the means to measure and characterize these things, please call, because I would love to make sure that we can make an apples-to-apples comparison as we do here for other sorts of liquid-liquid dispersions, for mass transfer systems, for mixing times, for NGS, et cetera. MSTAR's got a lot of validation, but the crystallization is a tough spot for us to get good data from our partners with.
Okay, next question. Can we model instantaneous crystal formation process? For example, barium sulfate precipitation process.
Well, this goes back to I started off this call with kind of just a passing introductory comment about fast reaction kinetics. Yeah, but it does necessarily require that we include some sort of competing and fast reaction kinetic. Said again, I use this word subgrid a lot. There seems to be a recurring theme of this particular seminar. There are ways to decompose a reaction into both fast and slow kinetics, typically using a linear interpolation between two fictitious or hypothetical reaction rates. So with the fast reaction kinetic model, we can describe precipitation and fast precipitation, but that does require some consideration. Again, I'm kind of presenting word salad here. It does require including yet another subgrid model to describe how the reactant is distributed among the fast and slow kinetics. Rukesh, great question. We can talk about that offline as well.
Okay, maybe we'll do our last question because we're almost at time here. What is the added value of such discrete approach versus population balance?
I always like, wherever possible, modeling physics using using a framework that matches the nature of the transport carrier. I think it's more organic to describe convective mass transfer coefficients. I think it's more organic to describe the ballistic versus diffusive transport. Population balance is good and it has a role, um, uh, ex- uh, especially in systems with absurdly large number of particles that may not be numerically tractable. But I would like to attack that problem using a Lagrangian representation that is more organically tied to the true nature of the carrier than to jump towards immediately statistical approaches. So, not a moral victory or not a moral qualm. It's just the thought that we should use the representation that matches the transport carrier wherever possible. But yeah, that's my attack on that. And yeah, Patrick, same question. If there's a collaborator that wants to talk about this experimental data, call. I'd love to tackle some of these subgrid models collectively. Thank you.
All right, well, great. Thank you so much, John, for your presentation today. And thanks to all of you who have taken time out of your day to join us. I want to remind you that this webinar has been recorded and it will be available to access soon on our website and on our YouTube channel. Please reach out if you have any additional questions and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.